The cruelest people don't always leave you in private, sometimes they invite an audience first. The ballroom of the Hilton Grand Magnolia glowed under gold chandeliers, every crystal glass catching the warm light like tiny sparks floating above the room, and Naomi Carter felt every pair of eyes turn toward her the second she stepped through the doors alone. A soft jazz piano drifted through the reunion hall while former classmates wrapped themselves in designer suits, expensive perfume, and carefully rehearsed success stories, but none of that stopped the silence that followed her entrance. 15 years after graduation, Ethan Whitmore had turned their reunion into his personal victory parade, and tonight, Naomi already understood why he had insisted she come. Ethan stood near the center of the room in an Eddie Taylor tuxedo, one hand resting casually around the waist of his younger girlfriend, blonde, polished, and sparkling beneath layers of diamonds that seemed chosen more for display than beauty. The moment he noticed Naomi, his smile widened slowly, like someone finally watching the last piece of a plan fall perfectly into place. "Naomi," he called loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, raising his champagne glass halfway into the air. "You actually came." A few people turned immediately. Others pretended not to stare while staring anyway. Naomi offered a small smile and walked toward her assigned table, the sound of her heels soft against the marble floor. Her black satin dress was elegant but simple, no glitter, no dramatic jewelry, just quiet confidence wrapped in clean lines and calm posture. Then people noticed the empty chair beside her. Ethan noticed too. "Oh," he said with fake concern, glancing toward the untouched place sitting next to her. "Your husband couldn't they make it?" The question floated through the table like smoke. Naomi reached for her water glass before answering. "Is coming." Ethan chuckled under his breath while a few old classmates exchanged awkward smiles. "Still optimistic after all these years," he replied. Laughter followed, soft enough to sound polite, sharp enough to cut anyway. Naomi did not react. She simply folded her hands in her lap and looked toward the ballroom entrance for half a second before returning her attention to the stage. Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal while making sure everyone nearby could still hear every word. "You know," he said, "when we divorced, I honestly thought you'd disappear completely." Naomi finally looked at him directly. "Calm. Unshaken." "And yet," she said softly, "here I am." For the first time that night, Ethan's smile flickered just slightly. Then the ballroom doors opened somewhere behind them. The ballroom doors had opened only long enough for a waiter carrying silver trays to pass through, but the brief interruption was enough to make Ethan lean back in his chair with a satisfied smile, as if even fate itself enjoyed embarrassing Naomi tonight. Around them, the reunion dinner continued beneath soft amber lighting and the low hum of old classmates comparing careers, vacation homes, and private schools for their children. Naomi could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing against her from every direction. So many people recognized her immediately. Others only remembered fragments. The quiet girl with the beautiful smile. The wife who used to support Ethan before he became successful. The woman who disappeared after the divorce. Ethan lifted his champagne glass again. "You know what I remember most about senior year?" he asked loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear. Naomi always believed hard work guaranteed a happy ending. A few people laughed carefully. Not cruelly. Just enough to stay on Ethan's good side. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the folded napkin resting beside her untouched plate. "And you believed money did," she answered softly. Ethan grinned. "Turns out I was right." His girlfriend, Vanessa, leaned against him with a polished smile that looked practiced in mirrors. The diamond bracelet around her wrist flashed beneath the chandelier lights every time she moved. "Ethan tells me you used to help him study all night during law school," she said sweetly. "That must have been exhausting." Naomi nodded once. "It was." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "I cannot imagine sacrificing so much for someone else's future." Naomi looked at her calmly. "Neither can I anymore." For half a second, silence settled over the table again. Ethan quickly laughed to break it. "Well, at least we can all appreciate how life works out in the end." He gestured around the ballroom proudly. Some people moved forward. Others stay stuck waiting for things that never happen. He says drifted toward the empty chair beside Naomi again. The untouched wine glass. The neatly folded menu. The second place setting that had now become the center of the room's attention. Naomi noticed whispers spreading from table to table. People pretending not to stare while constantly glancing back at the empty seat. Someone near the dance floor quietly asked if she had been stood up. Another guessed her husband probably was not real at all. Ethan heard the whispers too, and satisfaction slowly returned to his face. You know, he said, leaning closer toward Naomi, there is still time to admit you came here alone. Naomi smoothed the sleeve of her black dress carefully before looking toward the ballroom entrance one more time. Her expression never changed. No, she said quietly. I did not. The reunion host stepped onto the stage with a wireless microphone in one hand and a wide polished smile that looked exhausted from repeating itself all evening. Behind him, old yearbook photos flashed across giant screens mounted above the ballroom, frozen memories of football games, graduation caps, and teenage dreams that once felt bigger than the world itself. Laughter rolled through the room each time another awkward photo appeared, but Naomi barely noticed any of it. Her attention drifted toward the empty chair beside her again as the ice in nearby glasses clinked softly against crystal. Ethan noticed the glance immediately. You keep checking the door like a scene from a movie, he said with amusement. You know people are starting to feel bad for you. Naomi rested her fingertips lightly against the stem of her water glass. That is their choice. Ethan is mirket. Still calm. That used to drive me insane. Vanessa leaned closer to Ethan while adjusting the diamond bracelet around her wrist. Honestly, she whispered loudly enough to be heard, I think it is kind of sad. Naomi looked at her politely. What is? Vanessa gave a sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. Waiting for someone who clearly is not coming. A few people at the table suddenly focused very hard on their drinks. Nobody wanted to be part of the conversation, but nobody wanted to miss it either. Ethan relaxed deeper into his chair, enjoying every second. You know what Naomi was always good at, he asked the group casually. Believing loyalty mattered more than ambition. He laughed softly to himself before taking another sip of champagne. Meanwhile, I was trying to build an actual future. Naomi said nothing. She had learned years ago that silence unsettled insecure people more than anger ever could. Ethan continued anyway, unable to resist the audience around him. Back then, she worked 2 jobs while I finished law school, he said proudly, as if describing his own achievement. Night shifts at that bookstore cafe near campus, remember that place? One former classmate nodded awkwardly. Ethan smiled wider. She used to come home smelling like coffee beans and old paper at 2 in the morning, then wake up 5 hours later to help me prepare for exams. Vanessa blinked in surprise. Seriously? Ethan shrugged carelessly. Everybody sacrifices something when they are young. Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment, and suddenly the memory returned with painful clarity. Rain against apartment windows. Bills stacked beside a flickering kitchen light. Ethan asleep at the table while she highlighted pages in his law textbooks after working 10 straight hours on her feet. She remembered warming leftover soup at midnight because they could not afford takeout. She remembered believing exhaustion meant love was working. Then came the day Ethan passed the bar exam. 3 months later, he bought himself a new watch. 6 months later, he stopped coming home for dinner. 11 months later, Naomi found messages on his phone from a woman at his firm. And one cold November morning, she woke up to divorce papers resting beside the coffee machine like another unpaid bill. Life changes. Fast, Ethan said, pulling Naomi back to the present. Some people adapt. Others just stay sentimental. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward him again, calm as still water beneath winter light. No, she said quietly. Some people just forget who carried them when they had nothing. The smile faded from Ethan's face for the first time that night. The tension around Ethan's table lingered long after Naomi spoke, spreading quietly through the ballroom like perfume in warm air. Nobody expected her to answer him that way. Not after years of hearing only his version of the story. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo slowly, pretending her words had not reached him, but Naomi noticed the small change in his expression immediately. His confidence no longer looked effortless. It looked managed. Controlled. Delicate. Across the room, the reunion host invited everyone toward the dance floor for photographs and drinks while servers moved between tables carrying trays of filet mignon, roasted vegetables, and sparkling wine. Soft music floated beneath the chandeliers, but Naomi suddenly felt far away from all of it. The ballroom lights blurred slightly as old memories returned without warning. She remembered the tiny apartment she and Ethan once shared during his final year of law school. 800 square feet. Cracked kitchen tiles. A heater that only worked when kicked twice near the bottom panel. Every morning before sunrise, Naomi tied her bookstore apron around her waist and walked 6 blocks through winter wind because they could not afford a second cat at night. She sat across from Ethan at their small dining table while he studied case law for hours beneath a flickering lamp she found at a thrift store for $12. Back then, Ethan used to reach for her hand and promise her everything would be worth it someday. He used to say her sacrifices were temporary. He used to say they were building a future together. Naomi believed him so completely that she stopped imagining a future for herself. Then success arrived, and Ethan changed so gradually she almost did not notice at first. New suits appeared in his closet. Expensive watches replaced birthdays and apologies. Conversations became shorter. Work dinners became overnight conferences. One evening, Naomi spent 3 hours cooking his favorite meal after he made partner at the firm, only to watch the candles burn down alone while his untouched plate grew cold on the table. At 1:30 in the morning, he finally came home smelling like expensive cologne that was not his. 2 months later, she found messages from another woman glowing across his phone screen while he showered upstairs. Naomi never screamed. Never threw anything. Never begged him to stay. She simply sat on the edge of the bed with tears quietly rolling down her face while the sound of running water echoed through the apartment they once dreamed about together. Ethan told her the divorce was the practical choice. That was the phrase he used. Practical. As if 12 years of loyalty could be folded away like paperwork inside a desk drawer. Back in the ballroom, Naomi slowly exhaled and looked down at the empty chair beside her again. People still stared at it every few minutes. Some with pity. Others with curiosity. Ethan followed her gaze and smiled faintly, sensing the room drifting back in his favor. You know, he said casually while loosening his tie slightly, there is nothing wrong with admitting someone let you down. Naomi reached for the untouched second wine glass beside her plate and turned it carefully between her fingers. Her reflection shimmered softly across the crystal surface beneath the ballroom lights. Then she looked at Ethan with complete calm and said, the difference between you and me is that I survived disappointment without becoming cruel. The music inside the ballroom shifted into a slower jazz melody while people gradually moved toward the dance floor, but the tension surrounding Naomi and Ethan remained frozen in place like glass beneath winter air. Ethan forced a laugh after Naomi's last comment, though it sounded thinner now, stretched too tightly across his pride. Vanessa reached for his arm immediately, sensing the subtle crack in his composure before anyone else did. You are taking this reunion way too seriously, she whispered with a playful smile, trying to lighten the mood around the table. Ethan nodded quickly. Exactly. This is supposed to be fun. But Naomi could already see it in his eyes. He was no longer enjoying himself the way he had earlier that evening. Because the moment she stopped looking wounded, his performance stopped feeling powerful. Across the ballroom, servers cleared empty dinner plates while former classmates gathered near the bar beneath rows of glowing bottles and gold backlighting. Conversations drifted through the room in soft waves. Stock markets. Promotions. Summer homes in Cape Cod. Private schools outside Boston. Naomi listened quietly without envy. Years ago, those conversations would have made her feel small. Now they simply sounded tired. She remembered the first apartment she rented after the divorce. A tiny second-floor studio above a laundromat on the east side of the city. The radiator hissed constantly through winter nights, and the walls were thin enough to hear strangers arguing through the vents. Naomi spent the first month sleeping on a mattress placed directly on the floor because she could not afford a bed frame yet. During the day, she worked double shifts at a neighborhood bookstore cafe with chipped wooden tables and handwritten menu boards. Most nights, her feet hurt so badly she soaked them in hot water while sitting alone beside the kitchen sink. But little by little, something unexpected happened. The silence she feared became peaceful. She began reading again. Writing again. Laughing without checking someone else's mood first. On Sunday mornings, sunlight spilled through the bookstore windows while jazz records played softly near the register, and for the first time in years, Naomi felt like her life belonged to her. That was where she met him. Not at a gala. Not through money. Not through status. Used an older man in a charcoal gray coat who arrived every Friday afternoon at exactly 4:15 and ordered black coffee with no sugar. He always carried fresh white roses wrapped in brown paper. He never spoke loudly. Never interrupted. Never tried to impress anyone in the room. The first time Naomi noticed him, he spent nearly 40 minutes helping an elderly customer find a poetry collection she could not remember by name. The second time, he repaired a loose table leg himself after noticing it wobble beneath a customer's coffee cup. And every Friday after that, he sat beside the front window reading quietly while snow fell outside or rain traced soft lines down the glass. Naomi never asked what he did for a living. He never volunteered the answer. Back in the ballroom, Ethan leaned forward again, trying desperately to reclaim control of the evening. "So tell us," he said with another polished smile. "What does your mysterious husband actually do?" Naomi slowly folded her napkin beside her plate. Then she looked toward the ballroom entrance one more time, her expression calm enough to unsettle the entire table. "He listens," she answered softly. "That is why most people underestimate him." The question hung over the table longer than anyone expected. Ethan waited for Naomi to say something ordinary. Maybe an accountant. Maybe a consultant. Something forgettable enough for the room to laugh and move on. But Naomi only sat there calmly beside the empty chair while the soft glow from the chandeliers reflected across the untouched wine glass waiting beside her plate. "He listens," she had said. And somehow that answer unsettled Ethan more than any impressive title could have. Vanessa forced another smile and leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said lightly, "that sounds mysterious." Naomi returned a polite nod. "Not mysterious. Rare." Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose, pretending amusement while his fingers tightened slightly around his champagne glass. "You always did love turning simple things into poetry." Naomi almost smiled at that because years ago, he used to love that part of her too. Before his success taught him to value performance more than sincerity. Across the ballroom, the reunion host announced the beginning of the alumni recognition ceremony while giant screens displayed names and achievements from graduating classes over the past 15 years. Applause echoed through the room each time another executive, surgeon, or entrepreneur appeared on the screen. A dance law firm had sponsored part of the event, and Naomi noticed how much he enjoyed every handshake, every nod of recognition, every glance filled with admiration. He had built his entire identity around being seen. That was why tonight mattered so much to him. It was never really about Naomi. It was about proving he had won. Ethan stood when his own name appeared briefly among featured alumni. Several people clapped loudly while he gave a confident wave toward the stage. Vanessa touched his arm proudly. "You deserve every bit of this," she whispered. Ethan smiled, but Naomi noticed something strange. The more attention he received, the more often his eyes drifted back toward the ballroom entrance. Toward the empty chair beside her. As if some small part of him still needed confirmation that Naomi had truly been left behind. A server arrived to refill drinks, but Naomi quietly placed her hand over the rim of her glass. "No thank you." Ethan sat back down slowly. "You know," he said, lowering his voice again, "I almost did not invite you tonight." Naomi looked at him calmly. "Then why did you?" Ethan glanced around the ballroom before answering. Because I thought seeing this place again might remind you what ambition looks like. Naomi held his gaze for several seconds without blinking. No, she said softly. It reminded me what loneliness looks like when it wears an expensive suit. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside him. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Before he could answer, the ballroom entrance opened once more, this time slowly enough for cool night air to drift inside from the hotel lobby beyond. Several people near the back of the room turned instinctively toward the doors. Then the hotel manager himself appeared beside the entrance, straightening his jacket nervously as though preparing to greet someone important. Conversations around the ballroom began fading one by one. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the jazz music suddenly felt quieter beneath the weight of the growing silence. Naomi did not turn around immediately. She simply rested one hand lightly beside the empty chair and allowed herself the smallest breath of relief all evening. Then footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor behind her. The footsteps moved slowly across the marble floor with a calm rhythm that somehow silenced an entire ballroom more effectively than shouting ever could. Naomi remained seated for one more second before finally turning toward the entrance, and the moment she did, the tension inside her shoulders disappeared completely. Ethan noticed it immediately. That was what unsettled him first. Not the man walking into the room. Not the reaction spreading through the crowd. It was the simple fact that Naomi suddenly looked at peace. The older man stepped beneath the chandelier light wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit beneath a long black overcoat still carrying traces of cool night air. Silver touched the edges of his dark hair, and his posture carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades walking into rooms without needing Anjoni's approval. It was not flashy. No oversized watch. No dramatic entrance. But conversations across the ballroom died one by one the farther he walked inside. The hotel manager followed half a step behind him nervously while two event coordinators exchanged startled looks near the stage. Ethan frowned slightly. Who is that? Vanessa whispered beside him, suddenly sitting straighter in her chair. Naomi stood slowly beside the empty seat while the man approached their table with calm, unhurried steps. Everyone in the ballroom followed him now. Several alumni near the bar immediately recognized him, though nobody spoke loudly enough for the rest of the room to hear the name yet. Naomi's expression softened for the first time all evening. Not dramatically. Used enough for the years of exhaustion inside her to disappear beneath something quieter. Sapphire. The man stopped beside her chair and looked at her with gentle warmth in his eyes. I am sorry I am late, he said. His voice was low, steady, and effortless. Naomi smiled faintly. You are right on time. Then he reached down and pulled out the empty chair beside her before sitting calmly at the table as though he belonged there all along. Ethan stared at him, trying desperately to place the face. I do not think we have met, he said carefully, forcing confidence back into his tone. The man extended his hand politely across the table. Adrian Hayes. The second the name left his mouth, the atmosphere changed completely. Across the ballroom, someone near the stage almost dropped a champagne glass. One of Ethan's former classmates muttered, "No way," beneath his breath. Even Vanessa's expression shifted as recognition finally reached her. Ethan blinked once, then again, as if his mind needed extra time to process what he had just heard. Adrian Hayes. Founder of Hayes Capital. Billionaire investor. Owner of one of the largest private investment firms on the East Coast. A man whose interviews appeared in financial magazines beside presidents and tech founders. Ethan's law firm had spent nearly 2 years trying unsuccessfully to secure a partnership deal with one of Adrian's companies. Suddenly Ethan sat straighter in his chair, his earlier confidence draining quietly from his face. But Adrian did not look at him again. Instead, he turned toward Naomi first. Have you eaten? He asked softly. Naomi shook her head once. Adrian glanced toward a nearby server with calm courtesy. Would you mind bringing my wife a fresh plate while the food is still warm? The word settled over the ballroom heavier than thunder. My wife. Not once had Naomi tried to prove her worth all evening. She had simply waited beside an empty chair, knowing exactly who would eventually sit in it. The silence after Adrian introduced Naomi as his wife felt heavier than all the music and conversation that had filled the ballroom earlier that evening. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered with pity. The entire room had shifted direction so quickly that Ethan looked almost frozen inside it, like a man realizing too late that the ground beneath him was never stable to begin with. Vanessa slowly lowered her champagne glass onto the tablecloth, careful not to make noise. Across the ballroom, several alumni immediately began moving toward Adrian with nervous smiles and eager handshakes. One man from the graduating class of 2008 nearly stumbled over a chair trying to greet him first. "Mr. he said breathlessly, "it is an honor to finally meet you in person." Adrian stood politely and shook his hand once. Calm. Respectful. Completely unaffected by the attention surrounding him. Ethan watched the interaction carefully, his face pale beneath the chandelier lights. "You know him?" Vanessa whispered. Ethan swallowed once before answering quietly. "Everybody in corporate law knows him." The realization spread across the table one person at a time. Aegis Capital was not simply wealthy. It controlled investments worth billions across technology, real estate, healthcare, and private infrastructure projects throughout the country. Ethan's law firm had spent years competing for contracts connected to Adrian's companies. Last year alone, they lost 2 major deals after another firm secured his capital as a client instead. Suddenly Ethan understood why the hotel manager himself had greeted Adrian at the door. Why the ballroom changed the second he entered. Why Naomi never once defended herself all evening. Because she never needed to. One of the reunion organizers hurried toward their table carrying a nervous smile. "Mr. she said carefully, "we had no idea you would be attending tonight." Adrian adjusted the cuff of his jacket slightly. "I was invited by my wife." Again, the word settled over Ethan like a quiet humiliation far sharper than anything he had planned for Naomi. My wife. Not ex-wife. Not former burden. Not forgotten woman. Wife. Chosen. Valued. Love. Naomi sat beside Adrian with calm grace while servers suddenly rushed to refresh their table first. The same people who barely acknowledged her earlier were now smiling too brightly, speaking too quickly, laughing too eagerly. But Naomi noticed something important. Adrian never changed toward her. Not before the room recognized him. Not after. He spoke to her with the same gentle attention he showed inside the little bookstore cafe on quiet Friday afternoons. Ethan tried forcing a smile back onto his face. "Small world," he muttered awkwardly. Adrian finally looked at him directly for the first time that evening. His expression remained polite, though something cold and unreadable rested quietly beneath it. "Not really." Adrian said softly. "The world becomes very small when someone spends years underestimating the wrong person." Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. And for the first time in 15 years, Naomi watched him sit in silence while everyone else looked at her instead. The reunion continued around them, but the energy inside the ballroom no longer belonged to Ethan Whitmore. It belonged to the quiet woman he once believed would disappear without him. Naomi sat beside Adrian beneath the warm chandelier light while conversations shifted direction across the room like a tide turning after a storm. Earlier that evening, people looked at her with pity. Now they looked at her with curiosity, admiration, even regret. Ethan noticed every second of it. He loosened his tie again, though the room was cool. Vanessa barely spoke anymore. She kept glancing toward Adrian with the uneasy realization that the man beside Naomi carried more influence in one quiet sentence than Ethan could create in an entire speech. Near the stage, the reunion host suddenly approached their table once more. "Mr. he said nervously, "would you be willing to say a few words to the alumni tonight?" Ethan immediately looked up, hopeful for the first time in several minutes, as though Adrian's answer might somehow restore balance to the room again. But Adrian simply smiled faintly and shook his head. "Tonight is not about me." Then he looked toward Naomi instead. "It is about her." The simplicity of the moment landed harder than any public humiliation Ethan had planned all evening. Because Adrian never treated Naomi like an accessory to his success. He treated her like someone valuable long before anyone else in the room understood her worth. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, overwhelmed not by wealth or status, but by something she had almost forgotten existed after her divorce. Gentleness. Ethan stared at the tablecloth for several quiet seconds before finally speaking again. Naomi, he said carefully, I did not realize. His voice faded before finishing the sentence. Naomi looked at him calmly. For years, she imagined this moment differently. She thought she would want an apology. An explanation. Maybe even regret. But sitting there beside Adrian, surrounded by the soft music and fading noise of the ballroom, she realized something unexpected. Ethan no longer held enough importance in her life to wound her anymore. You did realize, she said softly. You just never thought I would survive it. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Across the ballroom windows, rain had begun falling softly against the city lights